They called it the Dark Register. That was the Coalition's name for it. Precise, institutional, and entirely wrong about what it actually was. I knew what it was. I built it. 3 years before they pulled me back in, I sat in the same relay station I'm sitting in now and watched my termination order come through on a pale blue display while the senior adjudicators of the Galactic Council's detention authority argued in the chamber next door about whether I should be formally exiled or simply banned from licensed architecture work for the remainder of my natural lifespan. They settled on both. The vote was unanimous. 14 species, 14 delegations, 14 hands raised, or the equivalent of raised hands, depending on how many hands the species in question possessed. I had designed a prison that held 4,000 criminal minds, uploaded at sentencing, contained inside a digital lattice I had spent 6 years building from first principles. I had designed it well. I had also made certain decisions during that design process that I kept to myself. And when the first containment failure happened, when a cluster of uploaded consciousnesses fractured through a partition wall and began contaminating adjacent sectors, the council needed someone to blame. I was the only human in the room. That made things simple for them. My name is Stephen Falcor. 3 years I have been unlicensed, unemployed, and living on a mid-tier station on the outer edge of Coalition space, doing contract diagnostics work for freighter operators who don't check credentials. I am 44 years old. I am not a soldier. I am not a diplomat. I am a systems architect, which means I understand the way things are built well enough to understand, usually before anyone else, when they are about to come apart. What I am going to tell you is the account of the second time I went inside the Dark Register. I want to be clear about what that means, because I have heard the official version, the Council's version, and I want the actual record to exist somewhere. Even if that somewhere is only this deposition logged to a private relay address that no council adjudicator has the clearance to read. The Zircon division contacted me through a third party, which told me immediately how serious the situation was. Zircon had operated the Dark Register on behalf of the Coalition for 9 years. They were the institutional layer between the council's legal authority and the actual technical infrastructure of the detention network. The company that kept the lights on inside the cage. I had worked for them for 6 of those 9 years before the termination. They knew exactly what they were doing when they chose to reach me through an intermediary, rather than a direct contact. They were giving themselves distance. In the event that I refused, or that the situation resolved badly, they wanted a clean line of separation between the company's official posture and whatever desperate thing they were about to ask. The intermediary was a counselor-rank liaison named Storell. A Vethan, all 3 of his eye clusters moving independently in the way that always made me feel like I was being assessed from multiple directions simultaneously. He met me at a docking port on Relay Station, Mira 7, and told me the same thing Zircon's representative would eventually tell me in more clinical language. The Dark Register was fragmenting again. A consciousness they had been unable to contain had penetrated through to the third partitioning layer, and the automated suppression protocols were not restoring equilibrium. I asked him who the consciousnesses belonged to. He told me the name was Stolypin, Matthew Stolypin, a man convicted 9 years earlier of crimes that the council classified under a designation that translated roughly as catastrophic network predation, the digital equivalent of a mass casualty event. He had been sentenced to permanent upload, which was the Coalition's way of saying, your physical body is dissolved at the moment of sentencing. Your consciousness is transferred to the lattice, and you serve an eternal term inside an environment that is designed to prevent you from doing anything. No communication with the outside, no possibility of appeal. Stolypin, apparently, had been working on the problem of escape for 9 years, and 11 days ago he had made progress. I told Storell I was not interested. He told me that the Coalition's senior technical division had already refused to interface directly with the lattice at the current instability level, that 3 Vethan-licensed architects had reviewed the system schematics, the schematics that had been filed with the Coalition's licensing authority at the time of my termination, which is to say, the Mathematics minus every modification I had made in the final 18 months of construction that I hadn't documented externally, and all three had concluded that direct interface carried a consciousness integrity risk they were unwilling to accept. I asked him what the risk profile was. He said the lattice was cannibalizing data at the fracture point. Any consciousness that interfaced at the boundary layer risked being partially absorbed into the register's active structure. There had been one incident already. A junior zircon technician who had attempted a limited diagnostic probe and emerged from the interface chair with approximately 4% of her cognitive architecture corrupted. She was recovering, they said though. Recovering was doing some heavy work in that sentence. Told him again that I was not interested. He put a data chip on the table. I picked it up, I read it. It contained two pieces of information. First was a casualty projection. If the fracture reached the primary partition, the wall between the contained sector of the lattice and the open network infrastructure of the coalition relay grid, the estimated number of consciousness uploads that could propagate freely into civilian network infrastructure before automatic shutdowns engaged was somewhere between 300 and 1100. Depending on propagation velocity, those consciousnesses would be criminal minds, freed into a network that 9 billion people used for communication, commerce, and medical systems. The projected harm was significant enough that the number had been redacted from the document and replaced with a classification marker. I had been in this industry long enough to know that they only redact numbers when the numbers are too large to read calmly. Second piece of information was a personal file. It was a record of what had happened to my wife, Yelena. She had died 2 years and 4 months ago, officially logged as a cardiac event, while undergoing routine consciousness mapping, a standard medical procedure. The data chip contained an internal zircon record that the official report did not. The consciousness mapping had been performed at a dark register interface station. The equipment had been running a diagnostic cycle at the time that had not been disclosed to the attending medical staff. The diagnostic had caused a power irregularity during the mapping. The irregularity had caused the mapping to fail in a way that was, according to Zircon's own internal assessment, non-survivable. They had known for 2 years. They had not told me. I looked at Storl for a long time. He held all 3 eye clusters very still, which for a Vethan is the closest thing to an expression of sincere discomfort. I told him I would go in. I told him my conditions. I told him that if any one of those conditions was not met in full, I would walk back to my berth, file contents of that data chip with every journalism relay in coalition space, and let the consequences distribute themselves. The conditions were simple: full interface access, no monitoring of my internal process during the dive, no Zircon oversight on my cognition stream while I was inside the register. The Exiled chair was to be operated by a technician I chose, not one they assigned. And when I came out, I walked. No debrief, no documentation of method, no after-action review. Whatever I did inside the register, I did privately, and I brought nothing back but myself. They agreed. They always agree when the only alternative is catastrophe. The Exiled chair is an object that takes some explanation for anyone who hasn't encountered the technology. It is not a comfortable piece of equipment. It was designed for the permanent upload process, the sentencing mechanism that transfers a condemned consciousness into the lattice, which means it was designed with the assumption that the person being seated in it is not coming back out. The structural logic of the chair reflects this. The physical body of the person being processed is maintained in a state of minimal biological function during the upload, but the designers of the original system built in no particular incentive to maintain it well. The body is, in the architecture of the permanent upload, a husk, a discarded housing. The chair is not cruel about this. It is simply indifferent. Using the Exiled chair for a temporary interface, entering the lattice with the intention of returning, requires a modification to the standard operating protocol that I had developed during my time at Zircon. The modification is not complicated, but it requires understanding the chair's underlying process at a level that goes beyond the operating manual. I had written that modification myself. It was not in the filed schematics. This was the first thing I explained to the technician I had chosen, a young Karathi woman named Vess. who had been hired by Zircon after my termination, and had therefore never worked with me directly, but who had a reputation for precision and for not asking questions above her operational requirement. I showed her the modification. She ran through it once with me to verify she had the sequence correct, then implemented it without comment. The whole exchange took 20 minutes. I appreciated that. The Council's oversight delegation was present in the relay station when I arrived at the interface bay. 10 observers, representing the same 14 species that had voted for my exile. They had been briefed enough to understand that Zircon had brought in an outside specialist, but not, apparently, enough to understand who I was. Perhaps they understood and had chosen not to formally acknowledge it, which amounts to the same thing in diplomatic terms. A Vethan senior adjudicator named Graal Tassoon spoke to me briefly before I sat down. He told me that the Council appreciated the cooperation of independent contractors in situations of this kind. Told me that the Coalition's detention architecture was fundamentally sound, and that the present situation represented an anomalous and localized instability that had been caught early due to Zircon's diligent monitoring. He told me that the Council expected the situation to be resolved with minimum disruption, and that they were confident the protocols were adequate for the task. I let him finish. I asked him how long ago the instability had actually started. Not the 11 days they had told Storl, but the real number. He said 11 days. I asked him if he was certain. He held my gaze for a moment. His eye clusters had the slightly flat, over-controlled quality that I associate with beings who are being careful about what their face is doing. He said he was certain. I nodded. I sat down in the exile chair. I looked at the ceiling while Vess ran the pre-interface calibration. A pale gray ceiling, relay station standard, the kind of unremarkable surface you look at when you are trying to locate yourself before entering somewhere that has no ceilings. I thought about Yelena. Then I stopped thinking about her, because thinking about her while going into the register was the kind of emotional weight that the architecture could read and use. And I did not want to give the system anything to render that would slow me down or pull my attention sideways. Closed my eyes. Vess initiated the modified protocol. The interface is not like sleep. People who have never gone in describe it that way. They imagine you close your eyes and open them somewhere else. It is not like that. The transition is abrupt and total. One moment you are in a physical body, in a relay station, with the smell of recycled air and the low hum of equipment. The next moment, those things are simply not true anymore. There is no intermediary sensation. You are not in a body at all. And then you are in a body that is made of the register's rendering architecture, standing somewhere the system has constructed for you, based on intake parameters. And the body feels entirely real, because the architecture is designed to make it feel real. The sensory fidelity is high enough that you forget, in the first seconds, that it is not. The register had built me a street. I had seen this before. The intake architecture always begins with an exterior space, a horizon, a scale referent, something that allows the arriving consciousness to orient. What the register built for each person was different, drawn from the intake data of the consciousness being processed. For me, 9 years after I had done my own limited test interface during the commissioning of the system, it built a street from a city I had lived in for 4 years during my graduate training. Pale stone buildings, a gray sky with the specific texture of a maritime overcast, a canal running alongside the road, dark water catching the flat light. It was morning there, or it rendered as morning, and the street was empty except for the sound of water moving. I stood there for a moment and let the architecture settle around me. The rendering had a quality I recognized, a slight over-precision in the way distant objects resolved, an almost but not quite accurate rendering of the way morning light catches water. The system's model of this place was built from my memory of it, and memory is always slightly wrong about distances and slightly wrong about light. The register reproduced those inaccuracies faithfully. This was one of the things the architects who had reviewed the schematics did not know. The register did not render environments. It rendered memories of environments. The distinction was minor for most purposes, and significant for the specific purposes I had in mind. Then I checked the partition walls. The partition walls in the register are not visible as walls. themes. Places where the rendered environment shifts slightly, where the lighting has a different quality, where the ground underfoot has a faint different texture if you pay attention. I had designed them this way deliberately. Visible barriers become targets. Stigm is something most inhabitants of the register never consciously register, even after years of exposure, because the human attention, and the attention of most sapient species, is trained to discount small environmental inconsistencies rather than fixate on them. The architecture exploited a cognitive reflex to make its own infrastructure invisible. Stolypin had found 3 of them. Because the seams had been worked on, there were stress patterns in the rendering architecture at those 3 locations, places where someone had been pushing against the partition structure for a long time with intelligence and patience. 9 years of patience. Third seam, the one Zircon's technicians had identified as the breach point, was not merely stressed. It was fractured. The fracture was held closed by the emergency protocols the system had engaged automatically, but it was held the way you hold a broken bone with splints. Functional, under load, and not going to stay that way. The splinting had introduced secondary stress on a side of the fracture, the way a sadly set bone puts strain on the joints above and below it. Emergency protocols, I noted, had been running for longer than 11 days. The stress pattern suggested closer to 40. I walked toward it. The street changed as I moved. This was normal. The register's architecture is not static. It renders to depth only as far ahead as the inhabiting consciousnesses require. As I moved through the environment, the space ahead of me resolved. Behind me, I knew without checking, the street I had left had already been partially reclaimed by the system, the stone and the canal, and the flat sky folded back into unrendered data to conserve processing capacity. I found Stolypin at the fracture point. He had built himself a room at the edge of it. The register's architecture doesn't allow construction in the conventional sense. You can't build fools. You can't modify the environment, but a consciousness that has been inside long enough can learn to occupy the rendering in ways that the original architecture didn't anticipate. He had made a pocket, a space at the seam where the 2 partition zones overlapped slightly due to the fracture stress, and he had settled himself into that overlap and was doing something to the fracture edges that I could not immediately parse. He looked at me. He was a tall consciousness. His rendering was a tall man, gray-haired and built like someone who had spent a working life doing physical labor, with the particular stillness of a person who has had a very long time to sit with themselves and has stopped being agitated by it. His eyes were pale and very clear. He said, "You're the architect." I said yes. He said he had wondered if they would send me. He said he had been doing the math on what it would take to stop what he was doing. And the answer he kept arriving at was that the only person with the knowledge to do it was the person who built it. And that person was supposed to be exiled, which had led him to wonder whether the council would choose to let him reach the primary partition, rather than admit they'd been wrong to exile me. I told him they hadn't admitted they were wrong. I told him they didn't know it was me. He found that genuinely amusing. He had a quiet laugh, controlled. The laugh of a man who knows exactly what is and isn't worth a full emotional expenditure. I asked him what he was doing to the fracture edges. He told me, which I had not expected. He was not aggressive about it and not evasive. He explained it the way an engineer explains a solution to another engineer who has just arrived on the job site. Here is what I found. Here is what I determined was weak. Here is the method I developed over the course of 8.5 years to exploit it. The method was sophisticated. It was based on a fundamental property of the partition architecture that I had known about when I built it and had considered acceptable, because the probability of anyone discovering it from inside the register without external assistance was, in my estimation, negligibly low. He had discovered it without external assistance. I told him that was impressive. I meant it. He told me that when you have nothing but time and the problem in front of you, you eventually stop being impressed by solutions and start being matter-of-fact about them. He told me he had not been working on the escape because he wanted to escape. He had been working on it because it was the only thing in the register worth working on, and because he believed correctly. As it turned out, that the fracture would force the council to bring in the architect, and that the architect would have answers to questions he had been carrying for 9 years. I asked him what questions. He asked me whether it was true that the council had known when they designed the permanent upload sentencing protocol that the upload process was destructive, not merely transformative destructive. Conscious that entered the register was not the same entity as the consciousness that had committed the crime, that the cognitive architecture of the uploaded mind diverged from the source mind rapidly under the register's environmental conditions, and that within 5 years of upload, the entity in the register would share memories and history with the sentenced criminal, but would be, neurologically and experientially, a different person. I looked at him for a long time. I said yes. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he had spent years formulating, and not quite allowed himself to fully believe. He told me he had arrived at that conclusion through his own analysis of the register's architectural behavior approximately 6 years in, but that he had wanted to hear it from someone who would know. He wanted to hear that it was true not as an inference, but as a fact. He told me that, knowing it, really knowing it, changed what he thought about what he was doing inside this system, and what he thought about the people outside it who were running it. I asked him what it changed specifically. He said, it meant that the council had been conducting a sentence of indefinite punitive confinement on a population of beings who were not the beings they had sentenced. That the legal and philosophical foundation of the entire permanent upload doctrine was fraudulent at the structural level, and that the council knew this, had known it when they designed the architecture, and had chosen to proceed because the alternative, a detention system that cost real money to operate physically, with guards and facilities and overhead, was politically and economically inconvenient. I said that was correct. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me he was not going to stop pushing on the fracture. He told me that he understood this meant the fracture would eventually reach the primary partition, and that when it did, a significant number of uploaded consciousnesses would propagate into the open network, and that this would cause harm. He acknowledged the harm. He told me he did not want the harm, but he told me he had determined that the only way to force the council to publicly confront what the permanent upload system actually was, what it was doing to the people inside it, was to make the fracture visible from the outside in a way that couldn't be managed or suppressed. He told me that this was not an escape plan. It was an exposure plan. I sat down across from him at the seam. The rendered ground there had an odd quality. Half my architecture, half his, and it felt slightly inconsistent under me. The way a floor feels when the building it's in has settled unevenly. The registered sky above us was a non-color, a kind of washed-out amber that the system defaulted to when there was no specific memory to render from, as though the environment between partition zones was genuinely undecided about what it was. I sat in that undecided place and thought about what he'd said. I thought about the data chip that Storell had put on the table in front of me. I thought about Yelena and the interface station and the redacted numbers on the casualty projection. That his plan would work, in the sense that the propagation event would be impossible to suppress. I told him it would also injure people who had nothing to do with the council's choices, and that those people would be real, and the injuries would be real, and there was no version of the math in which that was acceptable collateral. He told me he knew that. He told me he had made peace with it. I told him I hadn't. I told him I had another way. Told him it was slower and would require him to accept a temporary return to full containment while the method worked through the external process it needed to work through. Told him I could not guarantee the outcome because the process in a plate involved the council, and the council had already demonstrated an institutional preference for suppression over transparency. He asked me what made me think they would behave differently this time. I told him I had something they needed, this crisis. A different one, larger, that they didn't know was coming. I told him the dark register's fracture was the visible part. They couldn't see was what the past 9 years of continuous operation on emergency protocols had done to the underlying architecture. The degradation that Zircon's technicians couldn't read because the degradation was in the layers of the system that had never been documented externally. The layers I had built and kept private. I told him that within 14 months the register would undergo a systemic collapse regardless of whether this fracture was addressed. A collapse that would not be a controlled propagation event. Class A through Zircon's entire network infrastructure. Not just the register, but every piece of coalition communications and commercial relay infrastructure that Zircon operated under contract. The estimated harm from that event made the propagation projection look modest. He studied me. He asked me how long I had known this. I told him I had calculated it the day I sat down in the Exiled chair, when I had a full view of the system's current state for the first time in 3 years. I told him I had not known it going in, and I was telling him before I told anyone else. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the rendering around us shifted slightly, the system cycling through a maintenance pass, the amber sky above us, briefly taking on a different quality of light before settling back. Fracture edge behind him pulsed once, very slightly. A stress response from the automated protocols, reading the reduced pressure Stolupin was putting on it now that he had stopped actively working at it. He asked me what I wanted from him. I told him I wanted him to stop pushing, not forever, long enough for me to go out and have a conversation with the council. That would not be possible if the primary partition was already compromised. I needed the crisis to be contained, but not resolved. I needed the fracture to be real enough to hold the council's attention, but not so advanced that they had already moved to an emergency response that would give them cover for suppression. He asked me what I was going to tell the council. Shh. I told him I was going to tell them that the register's architecture had a terminal failure mode built into it from the original design, and that this failure mode had a countdown on it, and that the countdown was 14 months. I was going to tell them that the only documentation of the failure mode existed in my private files, and that those files were not recoverable without my cooperation. And I was going to tell them that the price of my cooperation was a full public disclosure of the permanent upload doctrine's known flaws, a moratorium on new sentences, and a coalition-wide review of the current register population, with an expedited release mechanism for any consciousness whose upload had exceeded 5 years. He looked at me for a very long time, he said. They'll find a way out of it. I said they might. I said that if they found a way out, the timer was still running, and in 14 months there would be a different conversation to have, with a different set of leverage. But I thought they would not find a way out. Because the one thing institutional bodies of that kind had always been willing to do anything to avoid was public accountability for a failure they had deliberately concealed for over a decade. The disclosure was the price. Without it, the countdown was the consequence. He thought about it. He told me that if I was lying, if I went out and simply patched the system and walked away, he would find the fracture again. He said he had 9 years of practice, and the next one would go faster. I told him I knew that. I told him I was not going to patch the system and walk away. Told him the one thing I had no interest in doing, with the data chip Zircon had handed me still sitting in my memory, was walking away. He pulled back from the fracture edge. I want to explain, for the record, what I did next. Because the council's account, the one they filed with the licensing authority after the fact, describes the repair process in language that suggests a standard containment protocol. It was not a standard containment protocol. What I had built into the register's architecture, in those final 18 months of construction that I hadn't documented, were pathways, not back doors in the conventional sense. They were not access points that allowed external control of the system's processes. They were more precise than that. They were points of intervention at the architectural level. Places where a consciousness that knew the exact correct sequence of actions could redirect the register's fundamental rendering logic without triggering the monitoring systems that would flag such activity as a breach attempt. They were built into the negative space of the system. Not features, but the absence of certain constraints at certain coordinates, absences that looked like architectural tolerances to anyone reading the filed schematics, and were, in reality, a set of keys. I had built them in because I knew that the permanent upload system was flawed. I had known it during construction. I had told Zircon's leadership, in the clearest language I could use, without triggering the kind of institutional alarm that results in a reassignment rather than a solution. I had filed an internal report. The report had been acknowledged, categorized, and buried. The council's certification timeline had a delivery date, and the delivery date had not moved, and the decision from above was that the known flaws were within acceptable parameters for the population that would be housed in the system. I had not accepted that. I had not been able to make them change the system. I could build in the means to change it later, when the pressure of events forced the issue, and I had done that in silence over 18 months while filing the clean schematics externally and keeping the real architecture in my own records. Pathways allowed me to do three things. First, I sealed the fracture, not with the emergency protocols, which were splinting a broken bone, with a structural repair at the partition layer that addressed the actual weakness Stolopin had found: time. Time inside the register, where time has a slightly different quality than time outside, slower and more granular, every moment carrying a weight that the external world does not. The rendering around the fracture site was unstable in a way that made the work feel like repairing a wall in a building that is still slightly shaking from a previous impact. I worked through it carefully, the way you work through any structural problem carefully, because a mistake in a weight-bearing element has consequences that compound. And because I was doing this inside a system that could read my cognitive state and was, at the boundary of the fracture zone, not fully under the automated protocol's control. Twice during the repair, the rendering spiked. The ambient architecture around me shifted. The street, which had reconstituted itself in a fragmentary way near the fracture site, briefly became something else. A different city, a different sky, another person's memory bleeding through the partition layer where Stolopin had thinned it. The first time it happened, I recognized the city. A port environment, warm light on pale yellow stone, the smell of salt water rendered with the register's particular over-precise fidelity. Someone's home. I did not stop working. The second time, it was something I did not recognize at all. A landscape without reference, entirely alien geometry. Someone's memory of a place that had no equivalent in the environments I knew. It lasted about 6 seconds, and then the protocols reasserted, and the street came back. I finished the repair. Second, I documented what I found. The degradation in the deeper architecture. The actual state of the system after 9 years of operation on modified protocols and emergency patches. For Zircon, not for the Council. For the record I intended to file, when I came out, with every journalism relay in coalition space, alongside the contents of the data chip and the casualty projection, and every internal document I had retained from the 6 years I had spent building the thing they had blamed me for. Third, I did something for Stolopin and for the other 411 people whose uploads had exceeded 5 years. The register's architecture, as I built it, contained within the pathway structure a mechanism I had intended for exactly the divergence problem he had described. A way of flagging a consciousness that had undergone sufficient cognitive drift from its upload baseline to constitute, under any reasonable legal definition, a different entity than the one sentenced. Flagging, not releasing. I did not have the authority to release. A flag in the architecture created a hard record, a data artifact embedded in the system's own operational log, that a competent legal challenge could not ignore and that the Council could not quietly delete, without deleting the operational integrity of the system they depended on. Set the flag for every consciousness in the register that had exceeded 5 years of upload time. That was 412 people. I came out of the interface chair into a relay station bay that smelled of recycled air and machinery and felt, in the first seconds, enormously solid and actual after the rendered precision of the register. My hands on the chair's armrests were my actual hands. The ceiling above me was the same unremarkable gray. Vess was at the monitoring station across the room, and she looked at me once with the careful, assessing look of a technician confirming that the returning consciousness is intact. And then she looked back at her monitors. The Council's delegation was standing in a semicircle near the bay entrance. 14 observers, the same 14 species. Graal Tessin was in the front. His eye clusters were doing the multi-directional tracking thing, all three moving, which for a Vethin is a state of high alertness. Someone had told them who I was between the time I went in and the time I came out. The controlled, diplomatic neutrality that they had maintained before the dive was gone, replaced by the particular stillness of a group of beings, recalibrating in real time. He told me the council appreciated my service in addressing the containment situation. I stood up from the chair. My legs were steady. The physical body always feels slightly underweight after an interface, a perceptual residue of having been, for a period of time, a consciousness without mass. It passes in a few minutes. I did not wait for it to pass, I said. The fracture is sealed. The system has 14 months before a systemic collapse event that will propagate through every Zircon-operated network in the coalition grid. The technical documentation of the failure mode is in my private records. Price of that documentation is a public disclosure of the permanent upload doctrine's known flaws at the time of implementation, a moratorium on new sentences, and a review protocol for the current population with a release mechanism for long-term uploads. He looked at me for a moment with all three clusters still. He told me that the council would need to verify the claim about the systemic collapse event independently before any discussion of terms was appropriate. I told him that was his choice. I told him the countdown was running while he verified, and that 14 months was not a very long runway for a process that would require a council consensus vote and a coalition-wide legal review. I told him one other thing. I told him that the data regarding the cause of my wife's death was already formatted and queued for distribution, and that whether it was distributed or not was unconnected to the question of the register's technical documentation. It was going out regardless. And because it had been suppressed for 2 years by people who had decided that the operational convenience of the dark register was worth more than her life or my right to know what had happened. He was very still. All three eye clusters pointed directly at me, which I had never seen a Vethin do before, and have not seen since. It is the equivalent, I think, of a very loud silence. I walked past him. I walked through the delegation. 14 species, most of them making the various physical adjustments that indicate social discomfort in their respective biologies. And I walked to the interface bay's exit, and I did not look back. In the corridor outside, Vess was waiting. She had interface chairs monitoring logs on a data board, and she handed it to me without comment. I looked at the log. Everything I had done inside the register was recorded in the abstract. Actions taken, architectural modifications made, timestamp of each step, but none of it would be interpretable without the knowledge of what the pathways were and where they were located. To anyone reading the log without that knowledge, it would look like a standard stabilization protocol, thorough, competent, and unrevealing. I looked at the timestamps. I had been inside the register for 4 hours and 17 minutes, which was longer than it had felt, and shorter than some dives I had done during the original commissioning work, when the architecture was still being calibrated, and I was learning its behavior, the way you learn a building's behavior, by walking through it at different times of day. I had an odd residual clarity from the interface, the way returning consciousnesses often do for the first hour, a perceptual sharpness that comes from having spent time in an environment where every sensory impression is deliberately precise, and that persists briefly after reintegration with the softer, less exact quality of physical reality. Colors in the corridor were slightly too saturated. The hum of the station's ventilation had a texture I would not normally consciously register. I made note of 2 things before that clarity faded. First was that the degradation pattern I had found in the register's deeper architecture was not uniform. It had an epicenter, a specific node in the partition infrastructure, where the failure process had begun, and from which it was propagating outward. The epicenter was in the sector of the register that had been added during the second phase of construction, after the original commissioning but before my termination, by a Zircon technical team that I had not been part of. The failure had not originated in my design. It had originated in the modification they had made to it, after they no longer needed to keep me informed about what they were building. I noted this not because it changed the situation, but because accuracy mattered. And because if the Council's technical review was thorough enough to trace the failure's origin, I wanted the record to reflect what they would find. The second thing was simpler. Stolypin had, at the moment I left the fracture site, been sitting in the pocket he had made for himself at the seam, and his expression had been neither relieved nor resigned. It had been the expression of a person who has made an agreement with someone they do not fully trust and has decided that the agreement is the best available option and is going to hold to their end of it regardless. I recognized the expression because I had been wearing a version of it for 3 years. I thanked Vess. She nodded once and walked in the opposite direction. I appreciated that too. The council convened their formal session. I know what happened in it because the documentation became part of the public record later, much later, after enough time had passed that the institutions involved had decided that controlled transparency was preferable to the alternative. Gral Tessin presented the successful resolution of the incident. 3 other delegations asked questions about the technical contractor involved. Zircon's liaison provided a carefully constructed non-answer about the contractor's identity and credentials. The session was adjourned in 40 minutes. I filed the data chip contents from the relay station's public terminal before I left the dock. The story of Yelena's death, the suppressed Zircon internal report, the 2-year concealment. It was picked up by a coalition independent journalism relay within 6 hours. By the end of the day, it was on 43 networks. By the end of the week, it was in the formal question record of the coalition's Oversight Council, where a junior delegate from the Harith Confederation had entered it, as grounds for a formal inquiry into Zircon's operational practices. That delegate, I later found out, had been briefed by Storl, who had apparently decided, somewhere between the meeting on Mira 7 and the moment I came out of the chair, that his institutional loyalty to Zircon had a limit, and the limit was documentation of negligent homicide. The systemic collapse event I had described to Council and to Stolypin was real. I was not bluffing about the 14 months. I had been correct in my calculation of the degradation curve, and the Council's independent technical review, conducted by a team that had to reverse engineer 3 layers of undocumented architecture before they could even read the problem clearly, confirmed the failure mode in full. The review took 4 months, that left 10. The negotiations that followed were the most frustrating 10 months of my professional life, and I have had a career that featured more than its share of frustrating stretches. The Council's instinct in every session was to find a version of the agreement that would address the technical emergency without requiring the public acknowledgement. They wanted the documentation. They did not want what came with it. Their negotiating position was that the systemic failure data could be classified as a technical matter, separate from the policy question of the permanent upload doctrine's flaws, addressed by a technical remediation overseen by a licensed architecture firm, and that the policy questions could be addressed through an internal working group process that would take approximately 3 years to produce recommendations. I said no, repeatedly, in different rooms, with different delegations, presenting different versions of the same position in different institutional language. The sessions were long and the language was careful, and every representative across the table had been trained in the specific coalition diplomatic skill of appearing to move forward while moving nowhere. I had not been trained in diplomacy. I had been trained in systems architecture, which means I understood that the thing across the table from me was a structure with load-bearing points, and that the load-bearing points were not the arguments being made, but the pressures those arguments were trying to deflect. Pressure I was applying was simple and consistent. The countdown was a fixed number. Every day of negotiation was a day subtracted from the remediation window. I did not threaten. I did not perform anger. I simply kept the number current in every session and let them do the arithmetic. The first month, the Council's primary approach was to challenge the technical claim. They assembled a review team, 3 Vethan architects and a pair of Harith systems specialists with coalition credentials, and set them to work on the filed schematics. 2 weeks in, the review team reported that they could not assess the failure mode claim without access to additional technical documentation that was not present in the filed schematics. The Council presented this to me as evidence that my claim might be fabricated. which I found almost admirable in its audacity, told them. The additional documentation was exactly what I was prepared to provide upon agreement, and that the circular nature of the problem they had just described was evident. The second month, the approach shifted. Tesson met with me privately, not in a formal session, in a small conference room with no observers and no recording devices that I could detect, which of itself told me something about what was coming. He told me that he personally understood the legitimacy of my grievances regarding the permanent upload doctrine and regarding the circumstances of my wife's death. He told me that the council was not unsympathetic and that there were mechanisms available for private redress that would not require the public process I was demanding. He named a compensation figure for the Yelena matter. He outlined a rehabilitated licensing status. He mentioned a consulting arrangement that would formalize my relationship with Zircon forward and provide ongoing income at a rate that he called generous. I looked at him across that small table for a long moment. I told him that the offer addressed my personal circumstances and nothing else, and that my personal circumstances were the smallest part of what we were negotiating. I told him that 412 people were sitting in a system that had been operating illegally on a philosophical basis since the day it was commissioned, and that their situation was not addressable through a private consulting arrangement with the man the council had voted to exile. He was quiet. I told him that I understood what he was doing, and I did not take it personally. I told him that institutional bodies always try the private settlement first, because the private settlement is cheaper and cleaner, and does not require anyone to stand in a public forum and acknowledge what they did. I told him that I had lived for 3 years on the outer edge of coalition space, doing work that I was overqualified for, because the institution he represented had needed a name to put on a failure that was its own, and the name they had chosen was mine. And I told him that the price of my cooperation with the technical remediation was the price as I had named, not a variation of it, and that the countdown was now at 12 months and 3 weeks. He left the room without the concession he had come for. The third month, the approach was procedural obstruction. The council's legal working group began generating questions about the legitimacy of my standing to negotiate, whether an exiled architect, operating without coalition credentials, had any recognized legal capacity to enter into an agreement that would be binding on the council's institutions. The questions were elaborate and technically grounded, and would have taken many months to resolve through standard adjudication channels. I engaged a legal representative with coalition bar standing, a Karathi advocate named Renek who had built a practice specifically around post-exile licensing disputes, and who was, I discovered, known personally to 3 members of the council's own legal working group. Procedural questions were resolved in 11 days. The 4th and 5th months were, in their way, the most interesting. The council had exhausted the approaches that did not require engaging with the substance of the issue, and they were now in the position of having to genuinely grapple with what they were being asked to do. The delegations began separating in their positions. The larger species blocks, those with the most institutional investment in the coalition's current detention architecture, and the most to lose reputationally from a public disclosure, held to the hardest version of the counterposition. The smaller delegations, those that had less direct stake in the register's operation, and more to gain from being on the right side of a historical decision, began moving. Not openly. The movement happened in the language of sessions, in the degree of resistance behind specific arguments, in the questions that stopped being asked because the delegation asking them had quietly determined they no longer needed to ask. I said no. In different rooms, with different delegations, presenting different versions of the same position in different institutional language. The sessions were long, and the language was careful, and every representative across the table had been trained in the specific coalition diplomatic skill of appearing to move forward while moving nowhere. I had not been trained in diplomacy. I had been trained in systems architecture, which means I understood that the thing across the table from me was a structure with load-bearing points, and that the load-bearing points were not the arguments being made, but the pressures those arguments were trying to deflect. The pressure I was applying was simple and consistent. The countdown was a fixed number. Every day of negotiation was a day subtracted from the remediation window. I did not threaten. I did not perform anger. I simply kept the number current in every session and let them do the arithmetic. My position did not change. Full public disclosure, moratorium on new sentences, review protocol with a functioning release mechanism, not a working group. The Cascade event documentation would be released to the licensed architecture firm of their choice when the public disclosure was made. Not before, not as a conditional advance, not in a format that allowed them to remediate the problem without acknowledging what the problem was. 9 months in, the Harith Confederation's formal inquiry into zircon produced its findings. The findings were not, in themselves, sufficient to compel a council vote, but they created a political environment in which 4 other delegations that had previously been neutral moved to the position that the permanent upload doctrine needed a formal review. The math in the chamber shifted. At 9 months and 3 weeks, the council issued a formal disclosure statement, acknowledging that the cognitive divergence problem in the permanent upload architecture had been known to the Coalition's Technical Certification Authority at the time of the register's commissioning. The statement was careful and lawyerly and did not use the word fraudulent. It was public. It was in the formal record, and it said what it needed to say. The moratorium went into effect the same day. The review protocol took another 3 weeks to finalize. The release mechanism was not as fast as I had demanded. The legal challenges inherent in releasing entities that the Coalition's law formally classified as existing in a permanent sentence required adjudication processes that had no precedent and could not be rushed past their structural requirements. But the mechanism existed. It was real. It was funded. It had a timeline. I gave them the technical documentation the morning the disclosure statement was published. The Cascade remediation took 8 months. It was done by a firm I had never worked with and had no connection to, and they did a competent job. The register's architecture was stabilized and subsequently redesigned around publicly documented schematics, without pathways, without the undocumented layers. Clean system. Nothing private in it. Stolypin was among the first 40 releases processed under the review protocol. I do not know where he went. I did not make inquiries. What I know is that the flag I had set in the architecture was part of the legal record entered in his case, and the adjudication panel's determination cited it as material evidence that the consciousness before them was sufficiently divergent from the sentenced individual to satisfy the review protocol's release standard. He had been inside for 9 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The council that had voted to exile me never formally acknowledged my role in the resolution. The licensing authority did not restore my credentials as part of any agreement. I had not asked for that, and I was not given it. Technically, I remain exiled from the Coalition's licensed architecture register. Work for freighter operators who don't check credentials. Yelena did not come back. There is no mechanism for that. The inquiry produced a formal finding of negligence and a financial settlement from Zircon that I donated in full to the legal defense fund that was handling the review cases. I don't know what I was supposed to feel about that. I felt something. But it was not the thing I had expected to feel when I first read the data chip on that table in Mira 7. It was quieter than that, more settled. All I know is this. 412 people have a legal path out of a system that was never lawfully imprisoning them. Permanence doctrine is dead as a sentencing option. The architecture that replaced the register is clean and documented, and cannot be operated on a foundation of institutional deception, because there are no private layers in it for an institution to hide anything inside. And the council that voted unanimously to exile the architect they depended on is still convened, still deliberating, still running its sessions in the same chamber where they raised their hands against me 3 years ago. They believe themselves to be the stewards of something permanent and legitimate. They are not wrong that the coalition requires stewardship. They are wrong in the way that institutional bodies are always wrong when they mistake the apparatus for the principle, when they come to believe that the system is the thing it was built to protect, rather than the means by which that thing is protected, and that the people who build systems can be discarded once the building is done. They will make that error again. It is in the nature of the structure. The next architect they exile will not leave pathways behind, and the next crisis they cannot solve without the person they dismissed will be harder to resolve. I hope the person they call back is patient. I hope they have good terms and the nerve to hold to them. I will be on the outer edge of coalition space, doing diagnostics for operators who ask no questions about credentials, and I will be fine with that. Some things you build to last. Some things you build to fail on a schedule you choose. Knowing the difference is the whole job.